Hi, we're really delighted to be joining you at the Amsterdam Dance Event. Of course, we'd have loved to have been with you in person, but situation being what it is, we're making the most of it and recording this online. And congrats to all the organisers at AID for making this event still go ahead despite the lockdown. My name's Jennie Morton and I'm delighted to be joined by the lovely Mr. James Blake.
Hi.
We're going to be just talking today about the connection between creativity and emotional health. And James, we've kind of talked about this stuff before, and I'm really interested in were there any differences for you from when you began your career before you sort of gained prominence in terms of your relationship with composing, with writing, with the industry, as to when suddenly you became prominent and you had other pressures?
I mean, yeah, there was a huge difference. I think a lot of musicians talk about the best time of their career being when nobody was watching and when there was no expectation, and at least creatively. And that, I guess, was, I mean, I'm a classic case of that. I think for the first couple, maybe 3 years of writing and putting music out, I really, and for the year before I ever did anything, there was this feeling of everything's new, you know, there's no expectation, people are shocked and surprised by anything, and, you know, because no one's ever experienced anything you've put out before. So, you know, in that moment, not only are you the new thing or a new thing, but you're also completely unselfconscious, and I think that has a very relaxing effect on the creative process. And then when people start to kind of looking for something that isn't a euphemism, so
label you or
label
pigeonhole you.
Pigeonhole you. That's the one. I think that has a very deteriorative sort of, if that's a word, psychological effect on your creative process. I think, you know, suddenly it's like, oh, they liked the thing I did then, or they didn't like the thing I did then, so I can't or I must do that. And these thoughts are happening during the writing process, which is an extremely unsettling feeling, and also just one that bastardizes the process. And now that doesn't necessarily feel like a big deal to anyone who's not a writer or a musician, but actually what it does is it stops you from connecting potentially with the thing you love the most. Because the thing you love the most is, you know, as David Lynch would call it, you know, catching the big fish. Just to like meditate on the thing you're doing and sort of reach inside yourself and pull out the most authentic thing. And you can't be authentic if you're self-conscious.
So it's kind of messing with the flow as well.
Yeah.
You've got parameters that. And what does it do sort of on a psychological level? Did it create frustration or?
Yes, I think frustration and, you know, whether it's this thing didn't do well, people didn't like it, or, you know, this magazine didn't like it, or this blog didn't like it, or even this person in my life didn't like it. Or they really liked it so much that it made the other things I do or have written seem to pale in comparison, and maybe I shouldn't do those things. And, you know, it's like, the honestly, to a creative, anxious person, which I think a lot of creative people are, you know, the critical eye of anyone else creates all sorts of, you know, conversations in your own head, and really just trying to silence those conversations is half the battle of creating.
And do you find you've found a kind of balance with that now? Have you been able to navigate those waters?
Yeah, and you know, I've been lucky. I've had a lot of approval in my career, and you know, I've had less criticism than I've had approval, and that's been very lucky. Although I'm not sure if that was the main reason that those conversations in my own head were silenced. I think mostly it was doing therapy. Figuring out why I needed the approval of strangers, and also having the acceptance of someone who I care about the most. You know, like that really goes a long way to help with those unsettling feelings of, you know, am I enough? What am I without my music? You know, what am I to people if I can't do this thing that I do? And if I can't do the thing I do, should I be here at all? Because that's that's a thought that really drove me to possibly the darkest point in my life, is where when I had writer's block, it made me think, well, I haven't worked on any of my relationships in the way that I have this thing that I do.
Yeah.
And so if I can't do it, then I might as well not be here.
Right.
And that was a very unhealthy thought, obviously, but it's one that I know a lot of musicians get to.
Yeah, it is this idea of you know, if I say to you, what do you do? I'm a musician.
Mm-hmm.
Who are you?
Yeah.
I'm a musician. You know, there isn't that kind of distinction, and so if that is removed from you, or you feel that you haven't, you know, achieved, or you're not succeeding in it, who are you and what are you?
Yeah.
And that can be very unsettling. And it's kind of you know, I've being a performer myself for many years, and then kind of moving into the science behind performance, I really wanted to understand that. What is it about creative people? Because it's a similar story. Yours is kind of writ large because you've had a very sort of prominent experience, but it happens on, you know, every level.
Yeah.
And so I kind of dived into the literature on creativity, and there was a particular research study that it was asking the question of nature versus nurture. Are you born creative? Is it inevitable, or is it nurture? Is it something in your upbringing? And what they showed in this study that was out of the Karolinska Institute in Sweden was that there are actually structural differences in brain anatomy and brain chemistry, so the way the brain is built and the way it operates, that actually predict creativity. It doesn't necessarily mean you will do, but when you understand what some of those differences are, it suddenly starts to explain this process. So one of the things that artists always get accused of, if you like, is, you know, oh, they're so dramatic, you know, they're all up or they're down, or, you know, they're hyper emotional and hypersensitive. But there is actually a biological basis for that, because there's an area of our brain called the thalamus, which acts like the filter for signals. So when you're out in the world, you've got smells, you know, seeing things, you're hearing things, we're being assaulted on many levels of our senses, and we need to be able to kind of dial down some of that noise to be able to focus on a narrow task and not just be like, oh, a squirrel, a bird, you know. Yeah, right.
like dogs, just
hyper aware,
totally.
and hyper vigilant all the time.
Yeah.
So this thalamus acts like the filter, and it filters down that information so we can put one foot in front of the other in a busy street. But to do that, it needs dopamine, and dopamine is it's our kind of reward chemical. That's what people kind of know it as. You know, you bottle of wine, a bar of chocolate will give you a dopamine hit. Your phone, yeah, which is a whole other talk. So it's required for that. So the thalamus has little receptors that soak up dopamine to allow you to filter. Yeah. And what they showed was that creative people, and their definition of that was the capacity for divergent thought, which is that being able to think of many things, think outside the box, not be stuck in a paradigm. That those people had fewer receptors for dopamine on the thalamus. So I put that down as we're less able to filter the crazy, right? So if you're trying to hold a conversation...
More easily overwhelmed.
Yeah. So if you're holding a conversation like this, say, in a busy restaurant, you know, if I'm in a restaurant, I'm like, oh, that's an interesting bass line to the music. Oh, they put a fork down. Oh, they're talking about football. Oh, that smells nice. Right. And then I'm trying to focus on the conversation.
I have to leave. Me and Jamila were discussing this yesterday, that I'm unlike her in one way, which is that as soon as we've finished a meal in a restaurant, I want to leave. It's like, as soon as I've taken my last bite, before I've even taken my last bite, I'm signalling the waiter.
Getting the bill.
Like, I want to pay up and I want to leave. And I'm like, even if Jamila's still eating, I won't leave, but I'll make the motion to accidentally make the motion to leave, and she'll be like, can I just finish my fucking meal, please? and it's because I'm an incredibly rude person, but it's also because as soon as the meal's done, I know that like this thing I was focusing on, the conversation in front of me, suddenly becomes overridden by the room becoming incredibly loud, and everyone's, you know, I just feel like I feel super overwhelmed immediately by the situation I'm in. And we joke about it, but it's also like there is this aspect to it, for sure.
It's a biological imperative for creative
which I'm now
people.
obviously going to use as an excuse.
Exactly,
so
it's my biology. I can't do anything about it.
Yeah.
And what's kind of interesting with this is it also connects into addictive tendencies, because if you think of, like, if you've been on stage doing a live show and you're hyper-stimulated, then there's all this noise and all this energy in the room, and
Yes.
and you come off and you're buzzing with it, and people are in your face, and you just want the world to narrow. It's just like getting out of that restaurant. I just want it to go quiet, and for that you need dopamine, but we just have this inefficiency to absorb the dopamine into the part of the brain that can make things go quiet.
Yeah.
So then what people will do is reach for exogenous forms of dopamine. So it's dopamine, they're basically dopamine hungry. So this can explain why you come off and it's like, well, I need the bottle of wine just to let me come down after the performance. I need to reach for the drugs. I mean, no one's addicted to cocaine, they're addicted to the dopamine their brain releases in response to taking cocaine. So it's a dopamine addiction. So this explains, again, this, we do have a disproportionately high rate of addiction in the creative world, and particularly in musicians. And there is a biological basis for this, and I think just understanding that as a musician is a relief in and of itself. It's like, it's not a fault that I have, it's actually part of what makes me brilliant.
Well, it's also, I think, because I think a lot of musicians don't necessarily feel brilliant. I think we feel sort of like outsiders, and actually that, it's the romanticization and the kind of mythologizing of our behaviors that contribute to us feeling like outsiders in some way. It's like, if you, there's this common held belief that, if a musician is depressed and anxious and kind of erratic and, easily overwhelmed up and down, then that must mean that they're doing something right. There's lots of concepts around depression and musicians that I really disagree with, because I think that if this was more widely understood, then we'd stop sort of mythologizing and therefore under-explaining those people. That whole thing has always really frustrated me, and even musicians maybe even playing into that, in lyrics. It really, really saddens and frustrates me, because I know that it actually goes further to ostracize us and isolate us in our mental illness when people speak about addiction and depression like that.
And adding almost an element of glamour.
Adding an element of glamour and an element of, well, just leave him alone then. If we just let him do his thing, because we'll get great art. And sometimes terrible things happen to musicians, and people go like, I'm sure we're going to get a great album now. That happens a lot. It happened recently. I mean, there are examples of this I've seen this year of people having great tragedies happening to them, and the YouTube comments are like, well, we're going to get a great album, and you're like, it's like, man, come on.
I mean, there's a huge amount of responsibility in the industry of how they work with their artists, and I think it's starting to happen. I'm starting to be contacted by more sort of record labels and people who are interested in what do we do to preempt some of this.
It's about fucking time, by the way, because like, how many years have record labels profited from the ups and downs and the creative output of musicians who are incredibly fragile? It should have happened a lot earlier that they would be interested in and touring agencies and festivals, and the industry has a lot that it can do for musicians, and it's never too late. But we need, as a community, I think we need more assistance when it comes to, and we need more people like you explaining us to us,
right? And also, what are the strategies if you see someone that you think has suicidal ideation, and you're a manager or something? What are the conversations you should have or shouldn't have? Because there are some things that can be very triggering, and some things that, and having a network. Who do I reach out to? And I always say to managers and people, don't wait until it happens. You need to have that infrastructure in place before you begin. And certainly when you're sending someone out on tour, you need to preempt any of these. You normally know where's the nearest doctor if you want to go to, but what about psychotherapists? What about,
and how not to pressure them, because one of the major things that happened to me, was conversations about how many people were relying on the fact that I was going to go on tour. So I've had conversations with management in the past, or with, you know, just people, whether they meant to or not, telling me that they were kind of relying on the fact that I was going to go on tour at a certain point. You know, their finances relying on me, and therefore relying on me finishing my album to get it in time for the tour to be booked, so that everything doesn't fall apart and that I'm not responsible for everything falling apart. Yes. That was, you know, those kind of conversations affected me in a way that were massively contributing to my mental health crisis. And I know that's a very common scenario for a lot of musicians. And, you know, it's I do think we are, you know, why is it, I mean, this is a question I have for you, why is it that creative people, I don't know if, I know this isn't just me, because I know a lot of musicians like this, but it's so common that we want to either provide for other people or bend to other people's will, or we're happy with lots of people relying on us, or, you know, and try and balance all these things, and ultimately it has such a terrible effect on our mental health. Touring is one of those things, but there's lots of ways that manifests. Why? Yeah, and what does that do to us physiologically as well?
Yeah, so there's been, you know, a lot of studies done of again, coming back to that nature and nurture argument of creativity, and we've talked about, yes, there's nature there's actually some structural differences that predict creativity, but they've also shown that childhood adversity can also be something that's very, very common in creative people, particularly in highly creative people. And if you are somebody who didn't feel safe and secure, and we're not necessarily talking about, you know, terrible trauma here, but just not feeling safe, you know, if you've got a highly anxious parent or a parent that's just not really very, you know, a bit absent, you're right, then you know, as a child, you are solely dependent upon your caregiver for your survival. We're not like some animals that are born and, you know, off they go and they're self-sufficient straight away. We're totally reliant upon them. So we have to protect them at all costs in order to protect ourselves. So if you've got, say, a volatile parent or a very anxious parent who never feels safe, your whole nervous system learns to auto-regulate based on those interactions. So if you have somebody who's not very well regulated themselves, your system doesn't learn to regulate, it learns by experience.
Wow.
So what you end up doing, if you feel insecure as a child, then you're going to feel like you have to protect the parent. And as a child, your parent can do no wrong, because if they can do wrong, the cognitive dissonance of how that would affect your survival is too much for a child. So they go, if they're not wrong, it must be me.
Yes.
So then we get shame coming in, and then we find, well, we have to please them, we have to take care of them and manage their emotional health in order to protect ourselves.
So that we're not abandoned in some way.
So that we're not abandoned.
Right, okay.
So you end up being a people pleaser, right? A yes merchant, and that then it spreads to all your other relationships. And so you end up sort of being the facilitator. Oh, I'll do that for you. Know, if somebody phones you up at 3 a.m. and says, I need a ride to the airport, rather than going, you know what, I've got a busy day tomorrow.
Boundaries.
Oh, yes, I'll do it. And then you go to, oh God, why did I say it? Why did I say it? So it breeds resentment. So there's always, there's a saying that if you have the choice between guilt or resentment, so guilt because somebody asked you to do something and you said, no, I'm sorry, and then thought, oh, I feel really bad, I wish I'd said no. Or saying yes and then resenting it inside, go for the guilt every time, because resentment is soul suicide.
Wow.
So you then turn all that at what you should have just gone no to that person. You're inside that expression of anger, which is an immune system response. We think of it as an emotion, but biologically it's an immune system response, which involves inflammation. So it's an inflammatory response. When we go into defense mode, we actually produce inflammatory chemicals, because our body thinks we're about to get attacked by a lion or tiger. It doesn't distinguish between a physical or an emotional attack. And one of the outcomes of a bear attack might be an open wound, so the body produces inflammatory chemicals in case we need to go and mend an open wound. If you're not expressing that outwards and burning that off, it turns inwards, and this can be the basis for autoimmune conditions, where
where
the body starts turning that inflammation on its own tissues, and it doesn't recognize self and non-self. The immune system says, is this me or is this not me? And those boundaries can be rather skewed. So if your emotional boundaries are skewed, your physiological boundaries are skewed.
Wow. You know, I've had like psoriasis my whole life, or since I was a teenager. And it gets much worse with stress. It gets much worse. I've noticed that it gets much worse if I allow myself to, say, not stand up to someone emotionally, or I say yes to something I really don't want to do, and then I feel resentment, or a lot of the things you're describing. And I know people. Lots of musicians have autoimmune disorders, and it's very common.
Right.
A lot of creative people.
Yeah, and it's just, and for me, the frustrating thing is that we know this. This is biologically proven stuff. It's not rocket science, and so nobody's really been connecting the dots with artists. And you go to school and train. If you're a dancer, if you're a musician, go and do all your technique training. But nobody ever trains you for how to manage a creative mind, how to manage a creative physiology. And if you look at the industry, it's a highly volatile industry, as you described. So we're taking a vulnerable population, throwing them into a highly volatile profession with no strategies of how to manage that, and then hoping that they swim, and a lot of them don't, they sink. And so like you say, just the mere understanding of that, the explanation of that, there's a relief in that which already drops you out of that defense state, and then you can start to learn when you understand it, and then you meet that person who triggers you. It's like, no, I'm going to preempt that, and I'm going to, there are tools we can use, sort of breath work, mindfulness practice and things, where we can begin to auto-regulate. So that a lot of work that I do with people is putting in the auto-regulation they didn't get as a child.
Yes.
And so you start to become in control of all those emotional experiences, and you are the puppet master of any interaction, rather than waiting to react. So I say we shouldn't be reacting, we should be responding. There's a difference there. But you need to have tools to be able to do that.
So in situations, for example, where there's a power dynamic that you can't shift, for example, there are lots of people with, in a label situation they can't get out of, or a manager who has a lot of power, and if they were to try and get out from within that situation, there'll be consequences. They'll be blacklisted or something. Yeah. What is your advice? Not for them in terms of strategically, but in terms of like managing the symptoms that arise in their actual body and mind from having to deal with an incredibly stressful situation like that.
Yeah, and that it ties in a bit to the lockdown we're in right now, because it's kind of that situation. You're locked into a deal or into a structure that is not necessarily helping you physiologically or emotionally. How do you handle that? And it kind of comes down to, I think it was Nelson Mandela said, after being in prison for so many years, they can lock up your body, but they can't lock up your mind.
Right.
It's kind of that principle that even if you're in a situation, because we can talk about, what's an ideal thing, an ideal world. It's like, we don't live in that world. We have to do the job. We have to play the game. But to understand that it's a game, and to understand, and I encourage people to start to really get to know themselves and learn who they are, that identity under the musician, which, you may need some help with that with a counsellor or a therapist, but you also then can use those tools to look at other people's behaviour. I mean, I love it. I mean, I was somebody who was highly anxious as a performer as well, and then since I've learned all this stuff, it's been me fixing myself as much as anything. And now I'm just fascinated by human behaviour. So now if somebody's coming at me in this very volatile way, I think, this is interesting. But I can maintain my physiology in the face of that, because I understand the mechanisms. My thing that helps me regulate myself is information. That's my kind of go-to. If I can understand it, that gives me power. All we're looking for is power and control in the situation. Right. So to empower yourself by understanding dynamics, and if someone's just behaving so badly, or or putting pressure on you that they shouldn't, I always think, what a shame. I wonder what happened to you.
Right. What are they responding to?
I start to come to it with compassion. I think, gosh, what made you be someone who ended up behaving like that? And it just kind of diffuses that again, I'm not then reacting to the behaviour.
Rather
I'm
than
responding.
fighting for control.
And when you understand
right.
what they're looking, everyone's just looking to be safe. The human body at a cellular level either runs the safe program or the unsafe program, if you really boil the body down to basics. And so people like that are running an unsafe program. So if I start to try and make them feel safe, so I start to drop into a place in my body that's just a calming influence, and we know now, we have an electromagnetic field from our body that interacts with other people's electromagnetic fields, and we can change the dynamics of any space. So I've trained myself to be the sort of key in those situations, that I know I can diffuse any situation. And even if I can't, if someone's going off on one, it's not about me, it's about them.
Right.
So it's just an analysis, and it's just a...
So more information is power, essentially, over your own, at least your own experience of that situation. Okay.
So that and then understanding the trigger. So I always say to people who have anxiety, who get triggered in those situations, like, well, before I knew it, I was just off, you have to train yourself, and it's a daily kind of thing, in moment-to-moment thing. Awareness. If you're not aware of that it's happening, you can't change it.
Yeah.
And with anxiety, once it reaches a certain pitch, it's gone. It's a runaway train.
Yeah.
If you can catch the earliest signs, you can preempt it, and you can dial your physiology back down with various techniques.
Right.
So it's about spotting what are the really early things that trigger you. What is it's that little tension in my belly, or it's my shoulders go up, or my breath gets tight, my throat closes up. So those little signs, and the more you train your awareness, the more obvious those become. And then as soon as they kick in, you dial them back down.
Could you explain, firstly, what the physiological effects are of becoming nervous before a live performance, and also maybe some tips on how to get around them, and actually because it's all right saying to someone, it's cool, just drink a glass of wine or whatever, or but are there ways that we can do it without alcohol or drugs, or
Absolutely.
Things that can help us just relax and stop those physiological things from impairing our performances, essentially?
Yeah, so it's kind of goes back to what we were talking about before about exogenous forms of dopamine. We also have endogenous dopamine that we can access if we know how to do it. We can get to our own pharmacy without reaching to the external one. With performance, I was a professional singer for many years, and I work with a lot of singers now with performance anxiety. And of course, it's the things that happen to everybody when they're anxious is breath gets high and shallow.
Yep.
Throat constricts, all the things that we don't need to be experiencing when we're about to vocalise are a physiological part of a stress response.
Yeah.
So we have to learn again to override those. And breath is a great one, because as soon as you take that shallow breath intake before you've got to sing a vocal line, you're done already.
I had a version of that happen when I did a showcase. So there was this showcase performance in New York, and I just kind of come to America, and I was playing for the label, like in front of the label for the first time at Webster Hall. And I remember this song called To the Last that I have has a really long note at the start. And I've been up drinking basically as well, like we'd been a bit irresponsible the night before, and it was the first note of the show. I was really excited, and I just went, "We're going to that." And I remember looking around and just being like, I mean, it's not the most well-known song on the album. Hopefully they don't realise this is the worst thing that could possibly happen at this moment, but it was pretty fucking embarrassing. So anyway, back to your... Sorry.
Yeah, well, it comes down to preparation. Again, people spend hours working on their songs, training themselves, but nobody trains to go on stage.
Right.
You need exposure therapy for that.
Right.
You can't just train someone in a studio and then suddenly go, now walk on this stage in front of all these people, and not expect the body to respond.
Yeah, they're
to
not
that.
astronauts, where
Exactly.
right? Okay, yeah.
So you have to actually train that process, and again, that's something that's been historically missing from a lot of arts training. Just understand that all those kind of crazy things that you feel are actually a fundamental part of what makes you good as a musician. So they have a purpose. It's just about managing it.
Because being overwhelmed is, we can regulate that to an extent, but ultimately our sort of neuro pathways have kind of been set in some way by our upbringing or whatever our experiences have been, and therefore trying to center ourselves, but at the same time knowing that, if we can music as an outlet rather than music as a sole purpose.
Yes.
You know.
Yeah. Great. Well, I think we're at the end of our time now, so I hope you've enjoyed that conversation, and we wish all you guys out there the very best, and hopefully we'll all be out and performing and enjoying all your work pretty soon. So from us in Los Angeles, bye for now.
See ya.